The rain has a peculiar way of cleansing London, not of sin, but of memory. Tonight, it glides down the lamplight like liquid glass, washing over a city that pretends not to dream. Somewhere beyond Baker Street, the echo of a chapel bell still lingers, a bell that tolled for the guilty and the good alike. Within our familiar sitting room, a fire burns low, and reason itself flickers beside it. This is a tale of conscience dressed as superstition, of candles that measured death by inches, and of a woman who mistook vengeance for absolution. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from this evening, and what hour keeps you company? I'd like to imagine the rain is falling there too. Now, draw nearer to the fire. The smoke remembers what men forget. And so, our story begins. The winter light that morning hung thinly over Baker Street, filtering through a fog that seemed reluctant to lift. I had been reading the morning paper when our landlady announced the arrival of a lady, nervous, veiled, and urgent in her manner. Holmes looked up from his armchair with that expression of tranquil expectation which always preceded the unfolding of a problem. She entered hesitantly, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that the leather creaked. Her figure was tall and graceful, yet her every movement betrayed some inner disquiet. Holmes rose courteously and indicated a chair near the hearth, but she recoiled almost imperceptibly, shaking her head. "I would rather stand, Mr. Holmes," she said in a low, trembling tone. "I have not sat in comfort these past weeks. The fear of what is to come will scarcely permit me rest." Her words carried the strange cadence of someone who half believed herself cursed. She lifted her veil, and I saw a face pale to the point of translucence, the mouth compressed in anxious dignity. "6 deaths, Doctor," she said, turning suddenly to me, as though seeking confirmation of her own sanity. 6 deaths in 6 years, each marked by a candle, guttered and dead before its time. Holmes's keen eyes glinted at that. "A singular measure of mortality," he murmured. "You will oblige us, Lady Agatha, with the particulars of these candles and the deaths that followed them." She nodded, her lips barely moving. "There were 7, Mr. Holmes. 7 candles that have burned in the family chapel since my grandfather's time. Each time one fails, a life within our house is taken. There is but one left now." Holmes inclined his head, as though greeting the arrival of some long-expected adversary. "Then, madam," he said quietly, "you have come not merely for reassurance, but for rescue." At his gentle bidding, she produced from her reticule a folded ledger bound in worn green leather, its pages filled in a delicate feminine hand. I moved closer as she spread it upon the table between us, the faint scent of lavender rising as she turned the pages. "Here," she said, pointing to a neat column of dates and names. Each death, my aunt, my cousin, my father, recorded beside the night the corresponding candle failed. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "The pattern is absolute, Mr. Holmes. Each candle extinguished itself without cause, and always, within the same day, another death." Holmes leaned forward, studying the entries with silent intensity. "Your records are exact," he observed, "a rare precision in the face of tragedy. I must congratulate you, Lady Agatha, on your composure." "It is not composure, Mr. Holmes. It is terror trained into obedience," she replied softly. "The last candle stands still, yet it seems to burn more swiftly with each dusk." He took down her words in his notebook, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the room. "You say the chapel is locked?" "Night and day, sir. My brother alone holds the key." Holmes closed the ledger and steepled his fingers. "Then perhaps the mystery lies not in faith, Lady Agatha, but in access." While I watched the colour drain further from her cheeks, Holmes observed her with an almost surgical detachment. "At what hour, madam, do these deaths occur?" he asked. "Near midnight, always," she whispered. As the candle dies. Holmes made a brief note. And the duration of burning? She hesitated. Each candle lasted near 12 months, save the last two, which burned in half that time. He nodded slightly, the lines of thought etching themselves upon his brow. Remarkable. 6 deaths, each a year apart, save for the acceleration toward the end. Time itself conspires with your superstition. She looked at him, almost pleadingly. You do not believe, then, that we are cursed? I believe, said Holmes, his tone cool, yet not unkind, that fear is the most obedient of servants. It tends to light its own candles when reason refuses to do so. I could see the faintest tremor in her hand as she adjusted her glove. Whatever this family affliction was, it had taken not only lives, but courage as well. Holmes, having noted every tremor, rose suddenly and crossed to the window. The last candle, Lady Agatha. Its flame remains unbroken. She lowered her head. For now, yes. At this, Holmes turned. And who is the next of kin to those already departed? My brother, Charles Melrose, she answered after a pause. The last of our line. He alone remains within Melrose Hall. There was a shadow of affection beneath her composure. He is a man of reason, Mr. Holmes, though reason falters where death is constant. 2 nights ago he found the 7th candle shortened by half, though no one had entered the chapel. The door was sealed, the key in his possession. Holmes's brows rose, and yet the wax had burned. So it seemed. The admission trembled in the air like a confession. I felt a cold current run through the room. Your brother believes, then, in this curse? I ventured. He would deny it, Doctor, and yet I hear him walking the halls at night. She clasped her hands once more. He fears the candle will take him before the month is out. Holmes gave a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh. Superstition is a convenient assassin, Watson, he murmured. It kills with the weapon of imagination. Holmes seated himself again and began his customary cross-examination, his tone as light as though they discussed the weather. You will oblige me, Lady Agatha, with a few particulars. When the 6th candle failed, did you notice whether the wax had been tampered with? She blinked, startled by the word. Tampered? Yes. Was any of the residue removed, scraped, or disposed of before examination? I cannot say. Our butler saw to it as always. Holmes tapped the arm of his chair thoughtfully. And the chapel itself? Is it well sealed? There are narrow windows high upon the east wall, but they are barred. The air is often stale. Ah, Holmes said softly, a room of worship that suffocates rather than enlightens. Curious. He made another note, then glanced up sharply. And what of your family relations, Lady Agatha? Were the deaths harmonious in inheritance? Her composure wavered. There was tension, she admitted. Old resentments, trivial at first. Holmes watched her keenly. And yet you falter at a name you have not spoken. She rose suddenly, her eyes glistening. Mr. Holmes, there are names best left to the dead. Indeed, said Holmes evenly, yet it is the living who so often carry them. After she had composed herself, Holmes regarded her for a long moment. The fire crackled softly, and the fog pressed against the panes like an unseen listener. At last, he turned to me. Watson, you recall my remark concerning the geometry of fear? Observe our visitor, its perfect example. Lady Agatha stood motionless, her hands clasped, her gaze upon the floor. Mr. Holmes, she said faintly, you will go to Melrose Hall. He inclined his head. I shall. It is my habit to visit places where logic is unwelcome. They provide the finest company for reason. She seemed almost relieved, though tears glimmered at the corner of her eyes. Then you will help my brother? I shall do what I can to help the truth, madam. Whether it spares him or condemns him lies in its nature, not mine. She drew a shuddering breath. The candle burns lower every night. It may not last the week. Holmes's voice softened to something near sympathy. Then we have our measure of time. Fear, you see, Watson, keeps better accounts than any clockmaker. As she departed into the deepening fog, Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette framed in dim light. 7 candles, he murmured, almost to himself. 6 lives ended by faith's shadow, and 1 still burning. I think we shall find, my dear Watson, that superstition wears the face of science, and that wickedness, when disciplined, can pass for fate. He turned then, the faintest gleam in his eye. Pack your bag, Watson. We dine early, and take the evening train to Kent. And thus began the case which Holmes, in later years, would call the curse of the 7 candles. The journey to Kent was marked by a relentless drizzle that turned quickly to a downpour, blotting the windows and rendering the countryside a blur of dark hedgerows and pale fields. By the time we reached the small station nearest to Melrose Hall, the light was fading fast, and the world seemed washed clean of colour. Holmes, ever unperturbed by discomfort, walked briskly along the lane that led to the estate, his collar turned up and his hat drawn low against the rain. I followed with less enthusiasm, weighed down by a sense of foreboding that grew with every step. The rain drove in sheets across the long drive as we approached the gates of Melrose Hall. The great house loomed before us, its many windows shuttered against the storm, and its chimneys breathing sluggish plumes of smoke that were torn away by the wind. The gravel beneath our feet gave no sound. So soaked was the earth that each step felt like treading on the heartbeat of something vast and sleeping. Holmes paused once, glancing toward the upper windows. "A curious stillness, Watson," he murmured. "One expects a house so besieged by misfortune to betray its unrest in motion or noise. Yet here, even grief is orderly." We were admitted by a maid who curtsied in silence, her candle trembling as she led us through a hall panelled in oak and hung with ancestral portraits whose eyes followed our passage. Holmes removed his wet coat, his gaze roving across the carved balustrades and the faint gleam of polished silver. "Observe, my dear fellow," he whispered. "No dust upon the mouldings, no scent of neglect. Fear is here, but it is a disciplined guest." A moment later, Lady Agatha emerged to greet us, pale and grave, her composure frayed by sleepless nights. Behind her, in the half-light of the corridor, I saw servants move like shadows that preferred not to be named. The drawing-room into which we were shown was large but close, the fire doing little to warm the heavy air. Lady Agatha motioned us to sit, though her own posture remained rigid, as though the act of resting might provoke some unseen penalty. Around us, the household staff had gathered in uneasy silence, the housekeeper clutching her apron, the footman standing too near the door, as if poised for flight. When Holmes invited Lady Agatha to recount the most recent loss, she spoke in a tone scarcely above a whisper. "My cousin Amelia, 6 months ago. The 6th candle died that night, and with it, her breath." A murmur ran through the servants, swiftly stifled. I noticed how each avoided the other's eyes, as though any shared glance might confirm guilt. The silence that followed her words was not the silence of reverence, but of habit, practiced, rehearsed, like the stillness of mourners too long acquainted with the dead. Holmes leaned forward, his elbows resting upon his knees. "You will pardon me, Lady Agatha," he said softly, "but I should like to meet the man who tends your chapel." "There is none," she replied. "Only Mr. Dallow, the butler, holds the keys, and he has refused to enter it since my father's passing." Holmes's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "Refusal," he murmured, "is a most expressive form of knowledge." We found Mr. Dallow in the servants' hall, a man of 60, tall and thin, his face composed in that professional blankness peculiar to long service. When Holmes asked whether he would accompany us to the chapel, the man's composure faltered. "Not after dark, sir," he said at last, his voice low but resolute. "I've kept that door barred these 6 months, and I'll not open it until morning light." "Because of ghosts?" Holmes asked, but without a trace of mockery. Dallow's eyes darted toward the corridor, as if the very word had summoned listening ears. "I have heard what I have heard, sir. There are sounds that don't belong to the living. Footsteps, knocks, once, a voice praying in no tongue I knew." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And yet you stay in service?" "A Melrose does not leave his post," the butler answered simply, "even if it costs him sleep." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "A noble sentiment. Still, I must insist upon viewing the chapel, tonight." The man hesitated, then pressed a small key into Holmes's hand with the air of one surrendering a burden. "If you go, sir," he whispered, "don't tarry near the vestry. There's something in that wall that answers when the wind dies." Holmes slipped the key into his pocket. "Thank you, Mr. Dallow. You have already been most instructive." The chapel stood at the far end of the courtyard, its roof dark against the storm-bruised sky. When we entered, the air struck cold as stone. The scent of old wax hung heavy. The silence was almost tangible. Holmes's lantern cast long, trembling shadows over the pews, until it came to rest upon the candle-stand. 7 wrought-iron holders, now 6 empty, and one bearing the last of the ill-fated candles. Holmes knelt, running a finger along the metal. "Watson, observe. Not a trace of wax upon the stand. Someone has been diligent in cleanliness, but not for devotion's sake." He turned a fragment of the holder toward the light. "Scraped clean," he said, half to himself. "Wax is a poor thief, but a human hand, that is another matter." I bent closer and saw the fine scoring of a knife upon the iron. What purpose could that serve? Holmes smiled faintly. Purpose hides best beneath habit. A chapel is an admirable place for concealment, since none dare profane it by curiosity. The candle's flame guttered as we stood, a tremor, in its light that seemed almost sentient. Holmes watched it for a long moment before saying, "We must assume, my dear Watson, that someone in this household has turned superstition into an art." Holmes began a systematic examination of the room. He moved with the quiet absorption of a man dissecting not a body, but a theory. Presently he stopped before one of the narrow windows, testing the latch with a gloved finger. "Here," he murmured. A bruise upon the metal, minute yet deliberate, the work of a tool, not weather. A draught slipped through as he spoke, brushing my face with a chill so sharp that I involuntarily stepped back. "Strange," I said, "that a room so seldom opened should breathe at all." Holmes raised his lantern higher. "And stranger still, Watson, that it should exhale perfume." I caught it then, a faint, acrid sting that was neither incense nor wax. "Chemical," I suggested. He did not answer. Instead, he drew a small vial from his pocket and held its mouth near the window frame, capturing the air. "A sample," he said at last. "Even superstition, you see, must obey the laws of chemistry." He straightened, his eyes alive with interest. "Let us not disturb the household with our findings. Fear thrives on secrecy. Let us feed it one more night and observe what it does with the meal." The rain had ceased, but the wind prowled around the chapel like something restless and unsatisfied. We lingered there in the half-dark, listening. The air had grown heavy, as though waiting for an unseen hand to strike a bell. Then, faintly at first, came the sound, a slow, deliberate knocking from within the far wall. 3 strokes, a pause, 3 again. I felt my heart leap. "Holmes! Good heavens, what is that?" He crossed the nave in 2 strides, pressing his palm to the cold stone. "A pattern," he said quietly, "and where there is pattern, there is mind." The sound ceased, leaving only the drip of rain from the roof. Holmes withdrew his hand, his expression unreadable. "Our ghost, Watson, seems most mechanical in its devotions." I stared at the unyielding wall. "Do you mean someone—" "Not yet," he interrupted. "But we are listening to a design. The dead are seldom punctual. The living, however, often are." He took one last look about the chapel, his lantern lowering to the stone floor where the shadows gathered thick as velvet. "Let us return to the house," he said. "The wall has spoken once tonight. It will speak again, and when it does, I intend to answer." And so we left that sombre place, the echo of the knock still lingering in my ears, like a pulse beating somewhere beneath the skin of the house itself. The morning broke grey and chill, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and extinguished fires. I found Holmes already at the breakfast table, his plate untouched, his gaze fixed upon a single folded note lying beside his cup. Lady Agatha entered soon after, pale as porcelain, her gloved hands trembling as she took her seat. It required but a moment's glance at her expression to know that the night had not passed without incident. There was no talk of the weather that morning, nor of any civil matter that might have eased the dreadful tension weighing upon the house. The servants moved about like figures in a dream, their faces drawn, their movements hesitant, as though each feared to make a sound that might summon doom. It was Charles Melrose who first spoke, his tone a strained parody of cheerfulness. "The candle," he said abruptly. "It has shortened again." The words struck like a chill wind through the room. Lady Agatha's spoon clattered upon her saucer, and for a moment no one spoke. Then she whispered, "It burns faster with each passing night." Holmes leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You saw this yourself, Mr. Melrose?" "Yes. The chapel remains locked, as before. No one entered. Yet the candle is shorter, by nearly an inch." I watched Lady Agatha's face as her brother spoke. There was a strange duality in her expression. Fear, yes, but something else as well. Some faint and terrible relief, as though each inch consumed brought her closer to an end she both dreaded and desired. Holmes noticed it too. I saw his gaze rest upon her for a long moment before he asked, with studied calm, "And the key, Lady Agatha?" "In my brother's keeping," she murmured. Holmes gave a faint nod. "Then it seems we are to dine tonight with Impossibility as our guest." By mid-morning, Holmes requested that the entire household assemble near the chapel door. The rain of the previous night had ceased, leaving the air thick and still, and the echo of our footsteps upon the stone passageway seemed unnaturally loud. Charles Melrose stood before us, the iron key in his hand. "I swear to you, Mr. Holmes," he said, his face flushed with a curious mixture of pride and agitation. "This door was sealed by my own hand last night. I turned the key, tested the latch, and placed wax upon the lock. No mortal hand could have entered without my knowledge." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And yet," he said softly, "we are told the candle has shortened." Charles drew himself up. "Precisely, sir. Explain that, if you can." Holmes regarded him with mild amusement. "I make it a rule, Mr. Melrose, never to explain impossibility before it has had the courtesy to reveal its cause." He turned then to Lady Agatha. "Tell me, madam, who stands to profit most from this sequence of deaths? Spiritual profit, perhaps, if not financial." Her lips parted, but no words came. Holmes pressed gently. "In my experience, curses are rarely distributed by the dead. Someone here finds the belief convenient." The lady's eyes flickered toward her brother, and for a moment I thought she might speak. But Charles broke in impatiently. "You shall see the chapel for yourself, sir. Perhaps then you will believe me." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, let us have a look at what faith and fear have built between them." Inside the chapel, the air felt colder than before, as though the stone itself held memory of the prayers once whispered here. Holmes's lantern light glimmered upon the candlestand, revealing the seventh candle, slender, stoic, its flame burning with a steady, unnatural brightness. Holmes knelt beside the brass holder and examined the hardened drippings upon the base. "Ah," he murmured, "even wax speaks, if one listens." With his knife, he scraped a fragment from the side and held it near the light. Note, Watson, how the surface bears the impression of ridges. Finger ridges, I should say. I bent nearer. Fingerprints? Just so. A whisper from the wax itself. It remembers what consciences forget. Charles frowned. You suggest someone touched it? I suggest, said Holmes, that the finger which left this mark does not belong to the Almighty. He placed the fragment carefully in a paper envelope, his movements neat and deliberate. The wax will not name its owner yet, he continued, but given time and proper provocation, it may be persuaded to speak. He straightened and surveyed the chapel walls. Come, Watson, there are human hands at work in this divine arrangement. The question is, what else have they touched? Holmes's inquiries soon extended to every corner of the household. Servants were summoned, questioned, and dismissed in turn until the youngest maid, a slight girl named Mary, entered the room with trembling hands. She could barely meet Holmes's gaze as she stood before him. You were on duty last night, he said, in a tone almost kind. You passed the east corridor at midnight. She nodded faintly. Yes, sir, to fetch water for Lady Agatha. And did you see or hear anything unusual? The girl hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door. Holmes waited in patient silence. At last, she whispered, I saw a shadow, sir, a figure. It moved along the corridor, toward the chapel. Holmes's expression did not change. A figure, male or female? I cannot say, sir. It wore a cloak. I thought it was the wind at first, but the lamps went dim as it passed. Did you follow? She shook her head vehemently. No, sir, I dared not. Holmes regarded her thoughtfully, then said, Fear can lend shape to darkness, Mary, but so can guilt. The girl burst into tears and fled the room before he could press her further. Holmes turned to me with a sigh. The shadow, Watson, whether born of the mind or of the flesh, must have left some trace. We shall discover which before dawn. That evening, Holmes issued instructions to the household with the tone of a general preparing for battle. No one, he said, is to leave their room after 9 o'clock. The doors are to remain locked, and the keys kept within. Lady Agatha looked as though she might protest, but one glance at Holmes's expression silenced her. Charles, however, laughed nervously. Do you truly think to trap a ghost, Mr. Holmes? I have trapped less tangible creatures, he replied. As the hour approached, I made quiet rounds of reassurance, checking that each door was bolted. The house was unnaturally still. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move. When I came to the end of the east corridor, I noticed one door, Lady Agatha's, standing slightly ajar. Before I could knock, it closed softly, as though by an unseen hand. For a long moment, I stood listening to the hush beyond the panel. Then I heard the faintest movement, perhaps a sigh, perhaps the rustle of fabric, and the unmistakable sound of a lock turning. When I rejoined Holmes in the library, he said nothing, but his eyes flicked briefly to the corridor behind me, as though he had already divined what I had seen. You have done well, Watson, he said quietly. The house is obedient. Now let us see which of its shadows proves disloyal. I must have dozed at some late hour, for when I awoke, the candles had burned low, and Holmes was no longer in his chair. The silence of Melrose Hall was profound, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. I rose and followed a glimmer of light along the corridor to the chapel door. There I found Holmes, motionless, his eye pressed to the keyhole. The lantern beside him had been dimmed to the faintest glow. What is it, Holmes? I whispered. He did not turn. Observe, Watson, he murmured. The candle. Look at it. Through the small aperture, I saw the seventh flame quiver as though in distress, its light flaring and falling in steady rhythm. It was almost as if the candle were breathing. Holmes's voice came low and distant. Even a flame, my dear fellow, keeps its appointments. The question is, with whom? He straightened then, his expression unreadable. Someone has made arrangements with death itself, and we are late to the meeting. Stay close, Watson. Before this night ends, we shall learn who attends that final vigil. The corridor seemed to tighten around us as the candle's glow flickered within, a faint and wavering pulse that marked the boundary between faith and fear. And in that trembling light, I felt the first true breath of danger, the knowledge that the next shadow to move might be human after all. The night was moonless, and the mist that crept from the woods lay thick upon the lawns of Melrose Hall. Not a branch stirred, even the owls were silent, as though nature itself feared to breathe. Holmes and I moved like trespassers through that unnatural stillness, the chapel rising before us, dark, solemn, immutable, the one witness to so many whispered deaths. Near midnight we took our positions at the edge of the chapel path, the gravel muffled beneath our boots. The door stood locked, yet the sense of waiting was alive within its stones. Holmes consulted his watch by the faint gleam of his lantern. 11:56, he murmured. If our intruder follows his rhythm, we have less than 10 minutes. I felt the hush grow heavier until each breath seemed borrowed from the air of the tombs. The candle's faint glow was visible through the narrow lancet window, steady, upright, indifferent to the fears it inspired. Holmes crouched beside the chapel wall, his ear almost pressed to the cold stone. "You hear it too, Watson?" he asked softly. "That peculiar resonance, a draught with direction." I strained to listen and caught what might have been the faintest sigh of air, a whisper from somewhere within. The minutes crawled. Even my heartbeat felt impertinent in that sanctified gloom. When at last the clock in the distant hall struck 12, Holmes's posture stiffened. He held up a hand for silence, as though silence were not already our master. "Now," he breathed, "let us see who keeps faith with superstition." At first, there was only the slow murmur of rain against the chapel roof. Then, without warning, a dull gleam moved within. A lantern, faint but certain, kindled behind the wooden screen that divided the nave from the chancel. Holmes's eyes gleamed like those of a cat catching light. "Observe," he whispered. "A trespasser who knows the ground. See how he skirts the altar rail. No hesitation. This is not his first sermon." Through the narrow aperture, I glimpsed the figure's shape, cloaked, deliberate, every motion constrained by purpose. The lantern's glow travelled along the pews, pausing near the candlestand, where the seventh candle burned in isolation. A spark of gold flared upon a sleeve. Metal, perhaps, and then the light dipped lower. Holmes's hand came to rest lightly on my arm. "Note the discipline," he breathed. "No wasted gesture, no curiosity. Our friend acts not in devotion, but in execution." The lantern flame swelled, casting its bearer in silhouette for a heartbeat, the outline of a hooded form, bowed, but not in prayer. It raised an arm toward the candlestick, then all at once the light faltered, as if swallowed by the air itself. The chapel returned to darkness. Holmes drew a slow breath. "Watson, we are not alone with the dead tonight. We are in the company of calculation." What followed was stranger still. The seventh candle, visible through the slit of stained glass, flared with a sudden, violent brightness, its light piercing the mist like a blade. I saw Holmes's profile illuminated, sharp and intent. He gripped my sleeve, his whisper taut with discovery. "Some substances, Watson, burn for reasons not strictly devotional. Observe the hue, almost greenish. A trace of copper oxide, perhaps, or phosphorus. This is no ordinary flame." For an instant, the candle blazed with unnatural life, the wax drooping in swift rivulets. Then it bowed, guttering low, its defiance spent. The air about us seemed to tremble with the final gasp of its light. Holmes's eyes did not leave the chapel. That, my dear fellow, was not divine intervention. It was chemistry in prayer's clothing. Whoever has orchestrated these deaths knows his compounds as well as his scripture. The darkness returned, heavier than before. The silence felt charged, electric. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Do you perceive it, Watson? The balance, as though the air itself has altered." I did, though I could not name what had changed. The very atmosphere seemed tainted. Neither smoke nor fog, but something unseen, waiting. A moment later, the cloaked figure reappeared, or so I thought, gliding soundlessly across the chancel. Then, with a movement swift as a candle's blink, it was gone. The lantern's glow collapsed into darkness, leaving only the faint shimmer of dying wax. Holmes rose, every muscle alert. "Now," he said quietly, "follow close." We entered the chapel, and a wave of heavy scent struck me, not incense, but something acrid and faintly sweet, clinging to the throat like medicine. I pressed my handkerchief to my mouth. "Chloroform," Holmes muttered, examining the air as though it were a physical specimen, "mixed with paraffin vapor. Ingenious. Invisible death disguised as piety." He swept his lantern along the floor. No sign of entry, no footprints on the dust. And yet, our ghost has come and gone. The chill deepened as I looked around the pews, half expecting to see some figure crouched between them. The candles still flickered faintly, sending strange ripples of light across the altar. "Holmes," I said, "was it human, what we saw?" He smiled grimly. "Human, certainly. But I grant you, Watson, a rare specimen of that species. Fear, perhaps, has made a phantom of him. Science has made the rest." As we examined the chancel, my foot brushed against something dark upon the flagstones. I stooped and found a thin black filament snagged upon a splinter of the pew. I held it to the lantern's glow. "A thread," I said. "From a cloak, perhaps." Holmes took it delicately between thumb and forefinger, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Indeed, and where there is thread, Watson, there is garment. Where there is garment, there is man. Threads are careless things. They seldom respect secrets." He placed it into his pocketbook with the reverence another man might grant a diamond. "Our friend's cloak betrays him. A coarse fibre, dyed recently. I'd wager it was tailored for utility rather than mourning." Holmes's gaze drifted to the candle stand. "Each clue, however slight, unravels another stitch. Soon enough, the whole fabric will fall away." As we turned toward the vestry, I could not shake the thought that the chapel's shadows seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with our movements. The candle still trembled upon its stand, as though aware that its flame had betrayed its master. Holmes moved to the altar rail, his eyes tracing the polished brass where the lantern's light had briefly played. He crouched, passing his gloved hand along its edge, and held it toward me. Even in the dimness, I could see faint smears of residue, dull grey upon his fingertips. "Grease mixed with reagent," he murmured. "A solvent strong enough to cleanse prints, but not all of them. Our ghost, it seems, wears gloves when awake, and none when at work. A contradiction worthy of inspection." He took out his lens and bent closer. "Observe, Watson, a faint indentation. Thumb to middle finger, the mark of precision. Not a servant's hand. This is the craft of someone accustomed to fine tools, perhaps chemical instruments. A scholar of death." Holmes straightened slowly, his face set in thought. "Such spirits as this do not haunt. They operate. They leave their gospel not in holy writ, but in evidence." I shivered, for even his calm reasoning could not dispel the uncanny chill of that place. The air still reeked faintly of chloroform, and the dying candle cast its final shudder of light across Holmes's features. He turned toward me, his expression grave but luminous with intellect. "Somewhere in this house, Watson, there are fingerprints waiting for us. Marks left by a murderer who believes himself unseen. And before this flame expires," he added, glancing at the wavering candle, "we shall know whose hands bear the stain." The flame bowed then, lower and lower, until only a frail thread of smoke remained, rising, twisting, and vanishing into the cold breath of the chapel. The library at Melrose Hall was a room of shadows and polish, its silence broken only by the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. The fire had burned low, and the air carried that peculiar stillness which precedes the confession of a soul long burdened. At Holmes's request, I had joined him there shortly before 10. Lady Agatha had retired, the household subdued into uneasy quiet. Charles Melrose entered a few minutes later, his hair damp from the mist outside, his expression that of a man resolved to face an adversary who bore his own face. He closed the door carefully behind him and turned the key. "I would rather this were between us," he said, his tone strained, "for what I must say is not fit for servants' ears, or for my sister's." Holmes inclined his head, folding his hands together with the patience of a priest before confession. "As you wish, Mr. Melrose. You have something to disclose?" Charles crossed to the hearth and stood with his back to the fire. The glow deepened the lines of his face, lending him a sombre dignity. "I have a debt to pay, Mr. Holmes, a moral one. It concerns the origin of what you call the Melrose curse." The word curse fell heavily upon the air, as if even utterance invited its shadow nearer. I watched him square his shoulders, his jaw tightening. He looked toward the shuttered windows, then back at us with eyes hollowed by remembrance. "What I tell you now," he said quietly, "I tell to cleanse my conscience before whatever judgment awaits me. But understand, the truth, once spoken, may damn me more than any curse." And with that, he began. His voice faltered at first, as though each syllable were drawn against his will. "It was 3 years ago," he said. "A winter night, fog thick as wool upon the road. I had been drinking at the club in Dunbridge. The mare was nervous. I drove too fast. A man came out of the lane, a tenant farmer, old Garth, crossing with his lantern." He paused, his throat working convulsively. "I did not see him till it was too late. The wheel caught him. He fell, God forgive me, beneath the carriage. For a moment, the library itself seemed to recoil. Even the clock, with cruel precision, marked the seconds of his shame. I wanted to stop," he went on, "but my companion, our steward at the time, urged me to go on. He said it would ruin the family, and so we rode on. The magistrate's report said the old man slipped in the fog. His widow was given a pension, and the affair buried." His hand trembled as he reached for the mantle. "But I hear the wheels still, gentlemen, every night in my dreams. When the first of the candles went out, I knew whose hand had lit it." He looked at Holmes then, not for absolution, but for verdict. The detective's face was unreadable. I could feel, however, that the atmosphere of the room had changed. Guilt had entered it like a draught beneath a locked door. Charles resumed, his tone taking on a desperate intensity. "Do you not see? The curse began with me. Each death, Amelia, father, the others, has been an installment on that night's debt. Fate collects its interest by inches." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "You speak of retribution, Mr. Melrose, not causation. I must ask, who first named these deaths as vengeance?" "My sister," he said hoarsely, "after the second tragedy. She claimed it was the farmer's widow who prayed against us, and that each candle's death would herald our own." Holmes nodded. "And when was that first candle found extinguished?" "The very week the widow herself died," Charles replied. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Ah, so she did not live to witness the supposed fulfillment of her curse. Interesting." He took a note in his pocketbook. "Tell me, Mr. Melrose, were the subsequent deaths sudden or lingering? One in her sleep, one by drowning, another from apoplexy, yet the candles matched them all." Holmes's voice softened, almost kindly. "Superstition, sir, is but guilt wearing a mask. The human mind seeks patterns where conscience already has drawn them." Charles's reply came in a whisper. "Then why do the patterns persist when belief fails? I have renounced the curse, and yet the 7th candle burns still and waits for me." Holmes closed his notebook. That, Mr. Melrose, is precisely what I intend to learn. A long silence followed. The only sound was the faint hiss of the embers and the occasional sigh of wind against the window panes. Charles seemed drained of will, the firelight playing upon his gaunt features. "I had to speak," he said at last. "If confession can stay the hand of this thing, I am willing to bear the shame. It is justice I seek, not mercy." Holmes regarded him with an expression of mild interest. "Justice, you say? A noble motive, though curiously timed." Charles's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Holmes's eyes glittered with quiet amusement. "Only that truth, like a carriage, may be driven to arrive precisely when it best serves its passenger. You confess now, after suspicion might have begun to drift your way." A flush rose to Melrose's cheeks. "Do you accuse me, sir, of deceit?" "Not at all," Holmes replied evenly. "I merely note that guilt and prudence are often indistinguishable companions. You are an intelligent man, Mr. Melrose. You must see that an honest confession may still be strategically punctual." Charles's anger faltered, leaving something rawer beneath. "I would give my life for one night of peace, Mr. Holmes. Does that sound like strategy to you?" Holmes looked at him with the calm of a man weighing not words but tone. "I believe," he said finally, "that peace has its own arithmetic. Let us see if your account balances." Holmes crossed to the table where the chapel ledger lay open among his notes. With deliberate care, he ran a finger down the margin. "You see, Watson, the 7th candle has shortened by nearly a quarter-inch since yesterday morning. Now, assuming no one entered the chapel, we must consider what force consumes wax without flame." He traced a column of figures with his pencil. Airflow, temperature, composition, each has its influence, but the rate here is too precise, too consistent. He turned suddenly to Charles. "Tell me, how often are the air vents above the chancel opened?" The question seemed to take him aback. "The vents? Rarely, I suppose. The butler manages the chapel's upkeep, once a fortnight perhaps." "Ah," said Holmes, as if the answer merely confirmed some earlier suspicion. "And he holds the keys as well, does he not?" "Yes, though he swears never to enter after dusk." Holmes made another notation, his manner deceptively casual. "Superstition is a convenient locksmith. A servant who will not open a door leaves it all the safer for the one who already has." He closed the ledger and regarded the candle's measurement once more. "Wax, air, arithmetic, and motive," he murmured. 4 parts to an equation that promises murder as its sum. When Holmes ceased speaking, the silence pressed upon us anew. Charles looked from him to me, his voice unsteady. "Doctor, you are a man of faith. You believe in conscience. Do you think me mad to see pattern in what others call chance?" There was such sincerity in his eyes that my answer came unbidden. "No, Mr. Melrose, I think you see what guilt would have all men see, a reckoning." He clasped my hand briefly, his grip cold and feverish. "Then you believe me?" I hesitated, but Holmes spared me the lie. "Belief is unnecessary," he said quietly. "Facts suffice." Charles turned toward him imploringly. "Then tell me what you suspect. I beg you, Mr. Holmes. If I am to die, let me at least know by whose hand." Holmes's gaze had drifted upward. His features softened into that distant, abstract expression I had come to know, the look of a man listening to something not spoken aloud. His eyes fixed upon the ceiling beams above the library table, where the faintest vibration trembled in the air, like the whisper of a hidden vent. When at last he spoke, his voice was barely above a breath. "Patience, Mr. Melrose. The dead are punctual, but the living more so. Before the next candle burns an inch, we shall have our answer." And as the words fell into the stillness, I saw again that faraway gleam in his eyes, the unmistakable light of discovery, tempered, as ever, by the shadow of dread. The drawing room of Melrose Hall was a gallery of ancestors, each rendered in oil and shadow, their painted eyes fixed in judgment from the high oak panels. The afternoon light, weak and yellow through the rain, lent the portraits a curious vitality, as though they leaned closer to listen. Mrs. Havers sat before them with the composure of a woman accustomed to scrutiny. She was tall, her mourning black, relieved only by a glint of jet at her throat, and her gloved hands rested one atop the other in perfect stillness. Holmes, seated opposite, regarded her with that detached politeness which I had learned to recognize as the beginning of dissection. "You were companion to Lady Agatha's household for 3 years, I believe?" he asked. "4," she corrected, her voice low and unhurried. "Her ladyship engaged me after her husband's death." "And during those years, you became acquainted with the family's traditions, the chapel, for instance?" A flicker, no more than a passing tremor, touched her composure. "One cannot live here without hearing of it." Holmes inclined his head, his tone almost conversational. "And yet, superstition is rarely sustained by hearsay. It thrives best where memory has motive." Her lips curved faintly. "Perhaps, or where grief requires structure, Mr. Holmes, we all build our own altars." It was a remarkable answer, part philosophy, part defense, delivered without emphasis. I found myself watching her as one might study a portrait, admiring the surface, yet wondering what the artist had chosen to omit. Her calm, I thought, was not natural. It was cultivated, as if she stood perpetually before a tribunal whose verdict mattered deeply. Holmes, who had been observing the play of light across her face, gave the smallest of smiles. "Indeed, Mrs. Havers," he said softly. "And some altars, I find, are built over graves we prefer unmarked." At his prompting, she spoke again, this time of the past. "You may as well know it, Doctor," she said, turning her gaze upon me rather than Holmes. "Sir Reginald Melrose, Lady Agatha's late husband, once offered me attentions which I neither invited nor encouraged. He was a man accustomed to obedience, even in affection." Her tone was level, almost detached, yet there was in it a faint echo of contempt, polished smooth by years of restraint. Holmes, ever sparing of sympathy, simply asked, "And Lady Agatha knew?" "She suspected," Mrs. Havers replied. "She was a proud woman, but not blind. When Sir Reginald died, she sent for me, out of guilt, I think, as much as kindness. She liked to see near her what her husband had desired and not taken." I could not decide whether her composure was courage or calculation. The truth, I suspected, lay somewhere between. Holmes leaned back in his chair. "And yet you remained." "Where else should I go?" she said quietly. "My life had already been rewritten by other people's mistakes. To leave would have been to confirm their narrative. I preferred my own." Her answer silenced even Holmes. She spoke not like a servant, but like an equal before fate, one who had long ceased to expect fairness from it. Yet beneath that calm, I thought I glimpsed a strain of something harder, the determination of a mind that had once known injury and had learned to refine it into composure. When Holmes rose, she followed, graceful and poised, but I saw the faintest tremor in her hand as she adjusted her glove. As she moved toward the door, Holmes's gaze sharpened. "One moment, Mrs. Havers," he said, his tone deceptively light. "Your wrist, you have a mark there?" She froze. "A mark?" "Yes, a trace of soot, if I am not mistaken." She looked down, and indeed, where her glove met the sleeve, a thin black smudge encircled the skin, faint but distinct. "I must have brushed the hearth," she said quickly. "The fire smokes dreadfully." Holmes's eyes held hers a second too long. "Of course," he murmured, "though soot seldom settles in so precise a band. It reminds me of the residue from candle smoke, the sort that stains not from accident, but from contact." Her lips parted, but no answer came. Then, with perfect poise, she inclined her head. "You are observant, Mr. Holmes. Too observant, perhaps, for comfort." "Observation, madam," he said, "is a courtesy I reserve for the innocent as well as the guilty. It ensures fairness." When she had gone, Holmes turned to me. "A curious detail, Watson. One does not light candles while wearing gloves unless one fears to leave behind a fingerprint. You suspect her then? He smiled faintly. I prefer to say I admire her precision. Guilt, like art, demands mastery of technique. Later that evening, I passed the open door of the chapel and paused. The faint glow of candlelight drew my attention, though all were meant to have been extinguished by 9. Inside, Mrs. Havers knelt before the 7th candle, her hands clasped, her lips moving in rapid, whispered prayer. The candle's light played upon her face, not softening it, but heightening every line of weariness and regret. Her words were scarcely audible, yet I caught fragments. Forgive me. Not meant to harm. Only peace. And the tone, more than the words, struck me as that of a woman pleading not to heaven but to someone who might yet answer. When I stepped upon the stone, she started violently, turning with the look of one caught in trespass. "Doctor!" she exclaimed. "You startled me." "I beg your pardon," I said. "I did not mean to intrude." She rose quickly, the light flickering upon the black sheen of her gown. "I come here often," she said. "The dead are kinder company than the living." Her voice trembled, and I thought I saw, for the first time, a crack in her composure, a flicker of emotion raw and dangerous. She passed me without another word, and the candle's flame wavered behind her, as if uncertain whether to follow or remain. I extinguished it myself before leaving, though even in darkness I could still feel the echo of her whispered apology. Holmes listened to my account with a calm that verged on indifference, though I could see the thoughts turning behind his eyes. "So," he said, "our widow prays to the dead, stains her gloves with candle soot, and speaks of remorse. A rich pattern indeed." "She may simply be guilt-stricken," I offered. "You saw how she trembled." Holmes smiled faintly. "Remorse and rehearsal are twins, Watson. Both weep convincingly. The question is, which one has learned the better timing?" He crossed to the window where the night wind stirred the curtains and spoke half to himself. "The soot was too regular, the prayer too specific, and she knows the chapel's locks. She must. Who else could have entered without force?" I ventured that perhaps the butler held the keys. "Possibly," Holmes allowed, "but she spoke of doors that open only once, to remorse. That, Watson, is not a metaphor. It is a confession disguised as philosophy." He turned then, his eyes glinting with that peculiar light of discovery. "She will not tell us when she opened it, but I believe the answer is measured not in time, but in sequence. The 7th candle, my friend, its hour approaches." That night, sleep eluded me. The wind pressed against the shutters, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 12. I must have drifted at last into uneasy rest, for I woke with the echo of a scream, sharp, despairing, and unmistakably female. I was out of bed in an instant. The corridor was alive with footsteps and frightened voices. The cry had come from the direction of the chapel. Holmes was already there when I arrived, his lantern casting wild shadows upon the walls. The air was thick with the scent of hot wax and something sharper. Burnt oil, perhaps, or chemical residue. Lady Agatha clutched the doorway, her face white with terror. "The candle!" she gasped. "The 7th candle! It's gone out!" Holmes stepped past her, his expression hardening. The candlestand stood as before, but the final flame had indeed perished, leaving behind only a thread of smoke curling upward like a soul in flight. Somewhere beyond the pews, the servants were gathering around a motionless shape upon the floor. The air felt heavy, almost reverent, as though the chapel itself mourned. Holmes's voice, when it came, was low and certain. "The curse, Watson," he said, "has completed its arithmetic, but I fear its author has overcounted." And in that moment, though I could not yet see the victim's face, I knew with a cold, sick certainty whose name would never again be called at Melrose Hall. The dawn that followed the night of the scream was one of those pale, indifferent mornings that seem to mock human tragedy by their very serenity. The rain had passed, and the air, cleansed of storm, drifted cold through the corridors of Melrose Hall. We found Charles Melrose lying upon the bed, his face as still as the wax beside him. The candle on his bedside table stood unburnt, its flame extinguished before ever it had taken life. There was about the chamber a dreadful composure, as though the air itself refused to acknowledge violence. Lady Agatha knelt by the bedside, her hands clasped in useless prayer. She murmured, "He looked so peaceful, Doctor, as though the curse had come at last to rest." I could not answer her. Peace there was, but of a kind that condemns rather than comforts. His features bore none of the struggle of heart failure. Rather, there was a curious slackness about the mouth, a relaxation not of nature but of chemical persuasion. Holmes stood by the window, his eyes travelling slowly from the candle to the grate, and thence to the faint shimmer in the air where sunlight met the curtain's edge. He said nothing at first, but I could feel the workings of that cold precision behind his gaze. At last he murmured, "The candle stands unspent. The flame did not falter because it was never lit. Yet something has burned here, Watson, something that leaves no ash." The words lingered in the stillness, and I found myself glancing again at the body, half, expecting it to stir and deny what Holmes had implied. But it did not. The peace of the dead remained absolute, and therefore unnatural. An hour later, the village doctor arrived, a stout, red-faced man whose manner was more suited to harvest fevers than midnight death. He listened to my account, examined the body briefly, and nodded with practiced solemnity. "Heart failure," he declared. "The gentleman has had shocks enough of late. It is the body's mercy to yield before the mind collapses." Holmes, seated by the hearth, appeared scarcely to attend. He toyed absently with the extinguished candle, its wick still virginal. Only when the doctor turned to take his leave did Holmes speak. "You are confident, sir, that it was the heart?" "Entirely," the man replied. "There are no marks of violence, no signs of poison. The pulse, when last noted by his sister, was weak. A natural end, I'd say." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, nature, that most versatile of alibis. Tell me, doctor, when were these windows last opened?" The man blinked. "Why, not since yesterday evening, I suppose. The servants were ordered to keep the room sealed against the damp." "By whose order?" "Lady Agatha's, I believe." Holmes inclined his head with grave politeness. "Indeed. Then we must thank her for preserving our evidence." The doctor looked puzzled but said nothing further. When he had gone, Holmes turned to me. "Heart failure, Watson. Yes, but not the heart's own idea." Holmes bade me fetch a hand mirror from the dressing table. "Hold it to the grate," he said. "Just above the embers. Now, breathe not." I did as he instructed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, under the faint warmth, a translucent bloom appeared upon the glass. Not the fog of breath, but a fine film, oily and irregular. "Good heavens," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "The residue of a narcotic gas, a derivative of ether and chloroform, gentle as a lullaby, lethal as obedience. It kills by courtesy, as I once observed in an experiment gone too well." He took the mirror from me, studying the stain, as though it might confess its maker. "The vent above the grate is narrow but sufficient. The candle, you see, was never meant to burn. It was meant to wait." "To wait?" "For its partner, Watson. The unseen flame that travels through air, invisible as guilt. When the vapour met the match, death became a sermon." He replaced the mirror with meticulous care. "Our victim inhaled not forgiveness, but its counterfeit. I fancy the murderer counted on us mistaking the courtesy of the poison for nature's compassion." By late afternoon, Holmes had drawn me once more to the chapel. The house, subdued and murmurous, seemed to watch our movements with dread. He carried a small candle and a length of wire and moved straight to the chancel wall. "Do you feel that, Watson?" he asked. "A draught, faint but deliberate," I crouched beside him and felt a whisper of cold air threading through the stone. Holmes produced a thin blade and probed the crevice beneath a hymn panel engraved with psalms. There came a faint metallic sound, then a release, a square of stone shifting inward on hidden hinges. Behind it yawned a narrow vent. Within, half concealed by dust and cobweb, ran a length of thin tubing no wider than a quill. Holmes smiled grimly. There is our preacher. The vent connects to the bedrooms through the old heating shafts. Each burnt candle merely timed the release of its vapour, a sermon that reached its congregation without need of words. I stared at the tube in horror. Then Charles Melrose was murdered by the same hand that lit those cursed candles. Undoubtedly. The medium is chemical, the message theological, guilt, retribution, confession. Whoever devised this contrivance preaches repentance through asphyxiation. He ran his finger along the dusted pipe. And note, Watson, the soot upon the stone. Someone tended this device recently. The gospel of death must, it seems, be read aloud once more. In the vestry, Holmes laid upon the table a half-burnt candle taken from the earlier deaths. With his knife, he split the wax lengthwise, revealing within a thin glass tube running through the core. "Observe," he said. "A hollow chamber filled with a slow-reacting compound, potassium chlorate, sulfur, and a binding agent. When the wick burns down, the reaction warms the tube, releasing the vapor from this concealed aperture at its base. Ingenious, the perfect clock of death." He traced the pattern of corrosion where air had entered the shaft. Each candle a timer, each pew an execution. The victims inhaled the fumes, believing themselves safe within their devotions. Only the order differed. Each flame, each death, a calculated rhythm. I could not speak for horror. Then the so-called curse was mechanical all along. "Science draped in superstition," Holmes said, "the most effective disguise of all." He replaced the candle upon the table with reverence, as though handling relics. The mechanism required precision, control of the chapel locks, access to chemicals, and a mind schooled in both patience and chemistry. He paused, his eyes narrowing. "And such a mind we have already met." When Holmes presented his findings to the assembled household, the air in the great hall seemed to tremble. Lady Agatha stood ashen, the servants pale and breathless. Holmes spoke without flourish. The so-called curse was no act of heaven, but of human reason misapplied. The candles were instruments, not omens, and the hand that placed them belonged to one who understood both the science of death and the art of deception. He turned his gaze toward Mrs. Havers, who stood apart, her black gloves folded before her. "Only one among you possessed the calm to maintain appearances, the skill to hollow wax without suspicion, the means to enter the chapel unseen. Grief can disguise many sins, madam, but not fingerprints upon brass." For a moment she neither moved nor spoke. Then, with a serenity more terrible than defiance, she said, "He killed my husband. I killed his name. Is that not balance, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes's voice softened. "Balance, perhaps. Justice, never." She smiled faintly, almost pityingly. "You mistake me, sir. I sought not justice, but forgiveness. I thought the fear of God might do what the law could not." Her composure broke then, and she sank into a chair, her hands trembling. But it seems even forgiveness can be poisoned. As the household watched in stricken silence, Holmes turned away, his face grave with thought. "The curse of Melrose," he said at last, "was not written in wax or death, Watson, but in the arrogance that believes terror can cleanse the soul." And in the hush that followed, I could not tell whether he spoke of her, or of mankind itself. The chapel of Melrose Hall had never seemed so alive in its stillness. The morning light, pale and brittle, broke through the stained windows in narrow beams that made dust motes look like slow-falling ash. The air was hushed, the hush of awe and fear intertwined. and when the household gathered at Holmes's summons, each step echoed like a prayer reluctantly spoken. We stood where so many had prayed and perished. Lady Agatha clutched her brother's rosary, her face a study in restrained grief. The servants lingered by the door, heads bowed, as though fearing to stand too close to the truth that had already claimed one of their own. Holmes alone appeared untroubled by the sanctity or the dread of the place. His gaze passed not to the altar, but to the candles, 7 of them, newly placed and unlit. "I ask for your attention," he said quietly. "Not for worship, but for witness. What you are about to see, ladies and gentlemen, is not a miracle, though it may resemble one in its precision." His tone was calm, almost conversational, but it compelled obedience. Even the air seemed to pause to listen. Holmes gestured toward the candles. "Each of these has been fashioned by the same hand that wrought your misfortunes. Observe them not as symbols of faith, but as instruments, ornaments turned executioners." Lady Agatha's hand trembled upon the pew. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "must we, here, of all places?" He inclined his head. "It is here, my lady, that the sin was performed. It is only fitting that truth should share the same address." There was no further protest. The small congregation of the living stood as solemnly as any at a funeral, waiting for the detective's strange sermon to begin. Holmes stepped to the altar rail and took up a knife no longer than a pen blade. With surgeon-like precision, he pared away the upper half of one candle, revealing within its creamy heart a sliver of glass, and a wire so fine it trembled at the touch. "You see," he said softly, "how simplicity disguises science. To the eye, this is mere wax. To the mind that conceived it, it is a timepiece, a clock of fire." He held the candle to the light, showing the tiny hollow that wound like a vein through its center. As the wick burns, it releases a precise heat. The wax collapses, air enters, and the chemical reaction within this glass tube begins. What follows is inevitable. The candle does not simply consume itself. It measures its death and schedules another's. His words were slow, deliberate, without cruelty. The logic of them had its own quiet horror. Each victim, Holmes continued, was seated within range of a vent through which the vapour passed. The candle dictated the hour. The murderer merely prepared the sermon and waited for her congregation to fall silent. A faint murmur ran through the hall, but Holmes raised a hand, and the sound died at once. "Let the evidence speak, not speculation," he said. "You will see that even a prayer's flame may be taught to kill." From his pocket, Holmes drew a small retort and a length of tubing. He warmed a fragment of the wax in the flame of his lantern, and presently a thin, invisible mist escaped. "Stand back, Watson," he murmured. "You may recall the principle of chloroform, though this is its subtler cousin." The smell was faintly sweet, almost pleasant, yet I felt a curious heaviness in the air, a languor that touched the senses before reason could resist. Holmes corked the tube and straightened. A compound of ether, camphor, and an oil derivative. Gentle enough to quiet pain, potent enough to still the heart if confined. The murderer understood both chemistry and patience. She relied upon the devout to close their eyes in prayer, never knowing that each breath they drew brought them closer to heaven or oblivion. He looked about the gathered faces, his voice low, almost compassionate. "A vigil, you see, can become the most obedient of assassins. No outcry, no struggle, no trace. The perfect disguise. Death by devotion." A shiver moved through those assembled, and Lady Agatha's rosary slipped from her hand, beads scattering across the stone floor like muted applause for the devil's ingenuity. Holmes waited until the sound had faded, then set the small retort upon the altar. "The weapon of faith, transfigured into science," he said, "and now the name of its minister." He laid out upon the altar 3 small objects: a glove smudged with soot, a key blackened by long use, and a torn thread of black cloth no thicker than a hair. The candlelight caught the edge of each. "This," Holmes said, touching the glove, "was found in the chapel vestry. Its stain derived not from ordinary dust, but from the candle soot that accumulates when one tends the vents above the chancel." He turned to the key. "This fits the inner locks of the chapel door, locks known only to Lady Agatha and her companion." Finally, he lifted the thread and held it up. And this fragment was taken from the hinge of the hidden vent, a thread torn from a widow's mourning sleeve. He looked then toward the far pew, where Mrs. Havers sat rigid, her gloved hands folded as though carved from marble. "Mrs. Havers," Holmes said quietly, "you alone could have entered without suspicion, lighted candles in the name of prayer, and timed them in the name of vengeance. The soot upon your glove is the signature you left upon every soul you condemned." The silence that followed was suffocating. Lady Agatha covered her mouth. The servants stared as though the very stones of the chapel had begun to bleed confession. Holmes bowed his head slightly. "There is no curse, madam, only arithmetic, and you are the sum." Mrs. Havers rose with a composure so absolute that it frightened me more than any outburst could have done. Her face, drained of colour, retained a severe dignity as she addressed Holmes. "You speak of vengeance," she said, her voice steady. "Then know why it was earned. My husband, Thomas Havers, was struck down on the Dunbridge Road by Sir Reginald Melrose's carriage. His body was left to the frost, his widow to the charity of lies. The magistrate called it an accident. The family called it providence. I alone called it murder." Her words rang clear in the vaulted air. No one dared interrupt. "For years," she went on, "I served this house in silence. I cleaned its chapel, polished its pews, listened to their prayers. But every candle I touched was a reminder. When Lady Agatha spoke of her family's curse, I thought, perhaps she was right. Perhaps heaven does punish. And then I understood. Heaven waits too long." She turned her gaze to the extinguished candles. "So I made my own reckoning. I sent each of them the same peace they had given him, painless, wordless, absolute." Her expression softened then, and I heard in her tone the strange duality of confession and benediction. I did not wish them to suffer. I wished only for silence. For once, I wanted the house that killed to pray for the dead and mean it. 2 constables stepped forward at Holmes's signal, their faces pale with the discomfort of duty. Mrs. Havers did not resist. She merely extended her wrists with the same calmness that had so often passed for virtue. Holmes addressed her gently. "Madame, you have built an altar to justice, but you mistook its God. Science may imitate providence, but it cannot pardon." She inclined her head. "Then let it condemn me swiftly." Holmes's gaze lingered upon her for a moment longer before he turned to me. From his coat, he drew a small vial sealed with wax, the same substance that had sealed each death. "This will go to the magistrate," he said. "A breath of proof, lest any doubt still breathe within the living." As Mrs. Havers was led away, the faint draught from the open door stirred the candles upon the altar. One flickered uncertainly, then steadied again. I could not tell whether it signified survival or judgment. Holmes watched the wavering flame, his expression unreadable. "There are crimes," he murmured, "in which the law finds its equal in conscience. Yet only one delivers mercy, and it is not ours to give." The chapel fell silent once more, the echo of her steps already fading into legend. And I, standing among the unlit candles, could not help but feel that the true darkness of Melrose Hall had only just begun. The afternoon had drawn itself into a long grey sigh by the time we returned to Baker Street. Rain pressed against the windows like a persistent visitor denied entry, and the familiar fire, though bright, seemed to burn with a borrowed warmth. I took my accustomed chair opposite Holmes, but even that simple comfort carried the echo of the chapel and its cold arithmetic of death. Holmes had been silent during our journey home, his face turned to the fogged carriage pane, his eyes fixed on nothing visible. I knew the look well enough. It meant that his mind was still working the residue of the case, sorting what reason could claim from what conscience refused. Now, in the privacy of our sitting room, he removed his coat, shook the wet from its folds, and stood a moment before the fire, as though testing whether it could thaw the memory of Melrose Hall. "You are thoughtful, Watson," he said at last. "I was thinking of Mrs. Havers," I replied, "and of how quietly she accepted her fate." He nodded. "Some crimes, my dear fellow, announce themselves by silence. A scream would have been less terrible." The words lingered between us, mingling with the patter of rain. I felt, not for the first time, that even the glow of our hearth could not wholly dispel the shadows that follow certain kinds of truth. Holmes crossed to his desk and began to lay out the remnants of the case as a priest might arrange relics upon an altar. First came the blackened thread, then the smudge of soot preserved on a handkerchief, and finally the little vial, sealed, still half filled with that invisible death which had crept through the chapel vents. "There," said he, with a faint smile, "the remains of our modern catechism, chemistry, calculation, and consequence. Tell me, Watson, what do these absolve?" I leaned forward, studying the objects. "They absolve no one, Holmes. They merely explain." "Ah," he murmured, "explanation, the nearest our century comes to grace. And yet, it is a poor comfort, is it not?" I did not answer. He turned the vial slowly between his fingers, and the firelight passed through the glass, casting a thin glimmer upon the ceiling. "These trifles," Holmes continued, "represent intellect stripped of morality. Observe how precise her science was, how unerring her method, and yet how utterly mistaken her heart. A woman who could weigh pity by the grain and time revenge to the second." He set the vial down gently. "There is a pattern in such minds, Watson, an arithmetic of the soul. Each believes they can balance the scales by calculation alone, forgetting that numbers do not forgive." I looked at the evidence again. It seemed less the debris of a crime than the remnants of some failed equation, an unholy sum whose answer had cost a man his life. "Holmes," I said after a long pause, "do you think justice was served?" He looked up sharply. "In what sense?" "In the sense that the dead rest easier for it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, that is not justice but poetry, and the world has little patience for poetry." Still, I could not let the thought go. "I keep thinking of the farmer her husband was, the man struck down and forgotten, and the years she lived beneath that silence. Perhaps her vengeance was the only voice he ever had." "Perhaps," Holmes allowed. "But vengeance, however eloquent, is still the grammar of guilt. It corrects nothing. It merely rewrites the sentence." I sighed. "Then punishment is hollow, and mercy a luxury." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, leaning back in his chair, "punishment is the body's answer to crime. Mercy is the soul's. The trouble is that they seldom speak the same language." He rose and poured himself a measure of brandy. "You, being a doctor, believe in healing. I, being a detective, am content with diagnosis. Between us, perhaps we make half a saint." His tone was dry, yet there was weariness in his eyes. I thought then how heavy even reason must grow when it has stared too long into the workings of despair. Holmes had taken to pacing, his hands clasped behind him, his head bowed in thought. The rain beat more steadily now, drumming upon the roof like a conscience unwilling to be silenced. "You see, Watson," he said at length, "what men call superstition is often nothing more than conscience given a grander voice. It borrows thunder to express a whisper." I nodded, though the remark perplexed me. "Then you think the Melrose curse was conscience, not belief?" "Precisely. A collective guilt that required ceremony to disguise itself. Each death, each candle, each prayer. It was the same confession spoken by many tongues. Mrs. Havers merely translated it into chemistry. His words struck me with a quiet horror. And whose conscience, Holmes? Hers or theirs? He paused by the window, his reflection merging with the rain-streaked glass. That, my dear Watson, is the question. Whose heart beats loudest in a haunted house, the sinner's or the witness's? He did not wait for an answer, and I, being honest, had none to give. The room seemed to hold its breath with us, as though the very air feared to disturb so delicate a truth. At last, Holmes reached for the candle upon the mantelpiece. "Observe," he said, striking a match. "Even the simplest flame tells a story." He let it burn a moment, then with a quick motion snuffed it out between finger and thumb. The smoke rose in a slow spiral, curling and uncurling as though reluctant to part with the memory of its light. We both watched in silence as it drifted toward the window pane, where the dim daylight caught it. For an instant, it seemed to write a wavering line upon the glass, a line that vanished almost as soon as it appeared. "See how it lingers," Holmes said softly. "Even extinction has its afterthought. So too with guilt. It ascends, it disperses, but somewhere it leaves its stain upon the air." He turned from the window, and I thought there was something almost human in his expression, a melancholy sympathy he rarely allowed to surface. "Science, Watson, is the study of what remains after the flame. But conscience studies the smoke. The last of it faded, leaving only the faintest trace of scent. It was, I thought, like memory itself, persistent yet elusive, proof of something that had burned and could not entirely be forgotten." The rain deepened as evening fell, blurring the outlines of the opposite houses, until Baker Street seemed to exist in a world of its own. The fire hissed softly, its embers glowing like the remnants of a conversation too weary to continue. Holmes sat in his armchair once more, his fingers steepled, his eyes half closed. I had written the final notes of the case in my journal, but even as I closed it, a faint unease remained. Reason had triumphed, yes, but in that triumph there was no triumphalism. The widow was in custody, the murders explained, the superstition dispelled. Yet the house of Melrose still haunted me, not for its mysteries, but for its silences. "Holmes," I said quietly, "do you ever tire of answers?" He smiled without opening his eyes. "Frequently, my dear fellow. But until men cease asking the wrong questions, I must continue providing them." Outside, a hansom rattled by, its wheels hissing through the puddles, and the sound faded into the distance. The rain continued its patient rhythm. Holmes stirred only to add another coal to the fire, and so we sat, he and I, listening to the slow breathing of London through the rain, two men who had seen the machinery of justice turn, and wondered, as all men must, whether the world was any cleaner for it. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the firelight tracing faint lines of fatigue across his face. The last of the rain sighed against the window panes, and Baker Street lay steeped in its familiar hush. "You see, Watson," he said, tapping the ashes from his pipe, "there is no ghost so relentless as remorse. Mrs. Havers believed she was delivering justice, but in truth, she was merely translating her guilt into arithmetic. Revenge is a poor accountant. It always overcharges its master." I nodded, though my thoughts were elsewhere. "And yet," I murmured, "the peace she sought seems to have found no one." Holmes regarded me quietly. "Peace, my dear fellow, is never granted by vengeance. It is earned by truth, and often paid for in sorrow." He turned his gaze back to the fire, and for a moment, I fancied that even the smoke curling upward carried the shape of a question left unanswered. "And so, dear listener, what do you think was her greatest mistake? The science she trusted, the silence she kept, or the heart she tried to silence within herself? If you have a theory, share it below. I'd be most curious to see how you would have judged the widow of Melrose Hall. And if tonight's case stirred your thoughts, do subscribe for more mysteries of Holmes and the strange shadows that reason alone cannot banish.